The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our newest webinar, ISO 27001, What CBs Expect from Internal Audits. I'm Karen Rawson, and I'm the VP of the DESARA Group. I'm joined today by Tim Woodcomb, Business Unit Director of NQA National Certification Body. Tim, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and your company?
Sure. Hello, folks. So I run the programs at NQA, which include ISO 27001, which we'll be speaking about today, along with some related programs, ISO 20000, which is IT service management, ISO 22301 for business continuity, and also the general ISO 9001 program. NQA is a certification body, and we'll talk about what that is for the folks that aren't already familiar. We're a leading global firm with offices throughout the Americas, EMEA, and Asia. We've been doing this for 30 plus years, and that's inclusive of a variety of standards. And at this point, we have about 40,000 clients or certifications out there.
Thanks, Tim. And a little bit about DESARA Group and myself. Again, I'm Karen Rawson. I'm the Vice President. We started this company as management system consultants back in 2008, but all of our staff has 20 years plus of experience in working with clients in a consultative way or in industry itself. And not only do we work with companies to start up their management systems like ISO 27001, ISO 9001, TL 9000, and others, but we also do gap assessments when you're getting ready for an audit or getting ready to start, just say, explore a management system. We do contract internal audits. So if you don't have the expertise or you don't have the time or you need to get caught up on internal audits or just turn it over whole cloth, that's something we do. We do supplier audits and also investigations and improvements when things aren't going the way you'd like them to do. But the one thing that we do not do is certify companies. That's up to accredited certification bodies like Tim's company, NQA, and we certainly recommend the major certification bodies throughout the world that can serve needs at a highly professional level, such as NQA. Our webinar today will last the full hour, including time at the end for questions. So as we go through the presentation, go ahead and enter any questions in the GoToWebinar chat panel screen, and we'll take those at the end. Also, we'll send out the recording of this webinar by Monday, along with a copy of the slides. And you can actually pick up a copy of the slides right now with by going to the handouts section of the GoToWebinar panel and download those so you can follow along and take notes while we talk if you'd like. Tim and I are going to go back and forth on this agenda today, with Tim talking about the CB's perspective, and I'll cover the internal side of things, since that's the role that our consultants at DESARA perform for our clients. The invitation to this webinar said that we're doing intermediate content. Well, over the last few months, we've done the introductory webinar, What is ISO 27001? And you can get that on our website or on NQA's website as well, I believe, and a number of different webinars that both companies have posted. But this one, we want to talk to members of the leadership team and to ISMS managers who want to make sure they're getting what they need from internal audits, and not just to prepare for CB audits, but to really raise expectations for what internal audits ought to be able to do for your company. They should be helping you identify and lower risks. If you're an internal auditor or a program manager, I hope you'll come away with some ideas that'll prepare you and your organization for CB audits and help you think of the ways the things you do in internal audits can add value, how you can strengthen your own audit skills and improve the program overall. Now, I know just from looking at the list of people who signed up for the webinar, we've got a number of CBs and consultants joining us today, and I'm really delighted. I hope that you'll use the chat feature to contribute your comments to make this better. And heck, if you disagree with us, put that in there too, and we'll discuss alternative viewpoints. This is our list of the top six ways to improve your internal audit program, the expectations of CBs, but you may have a few more on your list that we can add to it. We can all learn from each other to increase the value of internal and CB audits by keeping an open mind to what our clients can do to improve. If you're an organization that currently does internal audits, you may already be having some challenges that you know you want to improve on. You might have a great internal audit schedule planned, and then one department or another, or one of your auditors has to make a change. And that's inevitable. That's something that your internal audits should have the flexibility to accommodate. But a widespread pattern of delays can be an indicator that people aren't taking internal audits seriously. So if your internal audits are being delayed, that could be an indication that you have to ask if they're actually delivering any value. And sometimes they're not. People often complain for internal audits across management systems that internal auditor findings just create unnecessary work sometimes, like going back and updating records or changing procedures that no one really cares about. And it's just a stop in their regular process of getting work done. So if your internal audit findings are trivial, you can imagine that the audit program doesn't matter to many people. But think, why would only trivial findings or mostly trivial findings be coming up? And one reason can be that you have inexperienced auditors, or maybe the wrong people assigned to audit different areas. So in this webinar, we'll talk about internal auditor experience and competence, and how to get the right people, or which are the right people to have on your internal audit team. Well, if internal auditors write trivial findings and no one's in a hurry to get audits done on time, you might look at management as the root cause. The true root cause, are they giving the management system and its audit program and the findings it generates the right attention? Do they back up the importance of fixing things to come into compliance, remain in compliance with the standard, and to build up the effectiveness of the information security management system? And then finally, one reason that some internal audit programs are weak is because the people with the training and experience to audit or to be audited also have other jobs. They don't have the time to plan, to conduct, to write the reports, and then often they're the ones who are also asked to respond to audits because of their day job. They're responsible for parts of the management system. So now I'd like to do a poll, and we'll share the results in a minute. But what is the hardest part of ISO 27001 internal audits? Now I have my assistant Mariah on the line. Mariah, are you starting the poll?
Yes, I just started the poll.
Okay, now I can see it. Good. Okay, so select one of the following. What's the hardest part for your group? Is it the delays, the trivial findings, the auditor inexperience, management attention, level of effort? If you're a consultant or an auditor on the line, go ahead and write this based on your perspective of what you've seen in the field. And the looks like about a third of our attendees have voted. I'll give you another little while to look those over and think about your system. And I'll close the poll in a few more seconds. Votes are still coming in. I'll tell you afterwards what I think, in my opinion, is the biggest reason that people don't, that audit programs fail. Wow, it's with most of the votes in. Mariah, let's close the poll now and display the results. I'm a little bit surprised how evenly it all came out. We've got a good crowd on the call today, and it's pretty much even across the board, except for level of effort is the one that keeps coming out the most. And isn't that the truth? People have real jobs, and they don't do this that often. They're not like third-party auditors. And we can close the poll and remove that display now. Thanks, Mariah. That I'm not surprised that the level of effort is the one that keeps them from being truly effective, because if it weren't so much of an effort, everyone would participate. The thing is, the purpose of audits is very important to the success of your information security management efforts. Your internal audits are intended to confirm the intent, implementation, and effectiveness of your defined ways of managing information security. That is, they're supposed to confirm that you can ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the information that's important to your business, your customers, your stakeholders. So intent, we mean, did you set up a system that actually meets the requirements of ISO 27001? And if you perform what your system says you should do, your documentation, your training, your ways of working that you set up, if you actually do that, will you get the results you want? That's one of the first things certification body auditors are going to look for. And it should be at the basis of every internal audit too. Have we set this system up right so if it's followed, we'll get the results we want? Then implementation, you're confirming people are not just saying what they're supposed to do, but actually doing what they've said they'll do. And then effectiveness is for the auditor to not just say, did you follow procedures, but did we get the results we intended in the ways that we set up the system to get those results? So how do companies with an information security management system face risks? How do they make sure that the implementation actually leads to effectiveness of their management system? Well, they put systems in place. It's a system, a management system is a systematic way of working. Management is committed through planning and oversight of their goals and measurements throughout the year, not just at the time of the audit, but they're looking at it on a monthly and quarterly basis, looking at trends. And they treat the risks to the business in systematic ways to reduce them, or if they can't get rid of them entirely, to have contingency plans in place so that if a risk comes to pass, they're not going to get a huge impact from it. When things go wrong, companies with a strong ISMS investigate and actually improve the system so it won't happen again. And they put procedures in place to handle the major source of risks, one of the major sources of risks, changes. Planned changes as well as unintentional changes, changes that originate externally to your software, to your hardware, and to your processes. Also, companies with an ISMS in place recognize that the management system is not just a bunch of IT restrictions that are placed on users of the system, but rather information security is a company-wide approach. And one way they make sure their management system is actually effective is they put controls on the system itself by objectively evaluating their methods and their effectiveness through internal and external audits, as well as through their measures. Does your internal audit program deliver the results your organization needs to address risks? Well, in a few minutes, we'll talk about what are some of the issues with internal audit programs. But first, I want to talk about a little bit about the difference between internal audits and CB audits, and we'll then transition over to Tim to talk about the CB side of things. Sometimes all of your attention as an organization is on passing the certification audit and the annual certification body surveillance audits. But actually, your management system needs to be using a combination of CB audits and internal audits to get feedback on information security effectiveness. You see, both types of audits confirm the intent, implementation, and effectiveness of your ISMS against ISO 27001, but internal and external audits are bound by different standards to support their results. So if you ever went to a class on how to do internal audits, you learned the principles of ISO 19011. This is a standard that's a guidance document. You don't get certified to it, but certification body auditors will be looking at you to see if you've used those principles in your audits. It tells you the basics of planning, conducting, reporting, and closing any kind of management system audit. And then there are two specific guidance documents in the ISO 27000 family, ISO 27008, which is about auditing the management system side, the management review, the documentation, the competence of people, all those things that are in the clauses of ISO 27001. And then ISO 27008 gives you the guidelines for the assessment of security controls. And as far as I've been able to tell, there aren't training programs on those two. You've got to get those standards and read through them yourselves, except that that's what the DESARA group's internal audit classes will be built on, those rather than simply on 19011. And now I'd like to turn it over to Tim to talk about CB audits and what they're bound by. Tim?
Thanks, Karen. So on the CB side, first and foremost, it's important to know that certification bodies are also audited by their accreditation body. So in a sense, we kind of see it from both ends, and the rules that we need to abide by start with ISO 17021, which kind of sets the guidelines or the rules, if you will, for operating a certification body. You can almost think of that as akin to the ISO 9001 requirement. So that sets the processes and the rules that a certification body needs to follow as a baseline. Then in this case, ISO 27006 would be layered on top of that. ISO 27006, again, is a document tailored specifically or exclusively to certification bodies. In this case, for the specifics of certification bodies doing information security or ISO 27001 audits. So there are additional addended, if you will, requirements in 27006 that the CB also applies. Now, why would an organization want to certify your 27001 program? And I know a lot of folks on the line are already in this, so I'm not going to belabor it too much. But I think the primary reason is for the third-party attestation. So in many cases, it's going to be a customer expectation or maybe even a customer requirement for a supplier to show ISO 27001 compliance. And in most cases, simply attesting to that themselves or even having a second party do it does not hold the same weight as having a third-party independent certification body. Of course, there are the intrinsic values of looking at the system with a fresh set of eyes and from an organization or an auditor that has seen many systems to identify any shortfalls in the process or opportunities for improvement or ultimately risks in terms of the way they've approached it. And what you want to look for in choosing a certification body, NQA, of course, is one example of many certification bodies out there, but you want to be certain that your certification body is accredited. And in the US, we're talking about the ANAB, which is the typical accreditation body, because that, again, would be the firm that audits the certification body to make sure we're following the right rules, because customers in the know, again, will expect that the certification be not only from a third party, but an accredited third party. So in terms of a certification body auditor looking at internal audits, there are a lot of things that come into play with regards to the internal audits that the organization does. Number one, the internal audit requirement within the standard is really what we would consider a core requirement. So not only will the internal audit program be audited during the initial audit, but it'll be audited at least in some level at every subsequent audit. So it is a core requirement that's audited at every surveillance, at every reassessment. Really, you can expect it at every audit. And frankly, the role and the rigor of the internal audit does have an effect on CB findings. So if you have a very rigorous, robust internal audit program, that may negate some CB nonconformances if you've already found and begun to address some of those internal issues yourselves. So in short, the requirement in 27001, clause 9.2, talks about the fact that you as the organization must have internal audits at planned intervals. Typically what the auditor is looking for there is some type of schedule, and an annual schedule, I would say, is probably going to be the minimum expectation. A lot of organizations go to a 2 or 3 year planned interval, if you will, and of course that can change. So even if you have a multi-year program, we understand that those dates or those focus areas might change. We just want to see a plan and management of that plan. Obviously, the plan should include some level of covering the ISO 27001 requirements, and that would include, of course, the controls. And you can do that in a variety of different ways, whether it be by the particular way you set the program up by processes or by requirements. But at the end of the day, the audit should be rigorous enough and robust enough to demonstrate that you've confirmed internally your confirmation of the requirements of the 27001 standard. The requirement goes on to say that, again, the program talks about the frequency of audits. So the program that it described in the earlier kind of is the bigger picture. The frequency of the audit would get more into detail. Some organizations choose to have one audit per year, and that's the entire system audit. Other organizations choose to spread that out over the course of the year and might have smaller instances of focused audits. Neither is right, neither is wrong. It's really a matter of what fits your organization best. Audit methods would simply be the reports or forms or processes that you're going to go through in auditing. The responsibilities, of course, would be primarily the responsibility of who's going to be doing the audits, what are their qualifications, which we'll talk about. But there may also be other people involved or other responsibilities involved, be it an audit program manager, so to speak, to keep all that organized. And then certainly at the top level, top management or leadership would have some responsibilities to review the results of the audits, which really comes up back through management review. In creating that schedule, obviously think about the processes that you're going to audit, how you segment that, if you will, the correct team, the frequency or depth of those based in part on the risk of that given process, but also looking back at the past results. Were there non-conformances in certain areas? If so, you might expedite or increase the frequency of the audit of those areas. And then when you're looking at any given audit, so for each internal audit, these are the things, the four main things that you want to think about. And again, this comes right from the standard. But for each audit, there does need to be a defined scope or criteria. So if you're doing a full system audit, that's pretty self-explanatory. It's going to be everything. But if you are doing a partial audit, you would need to, again, define how you're slicing and dicing that, whether it's by department, whether it's by process. It could be by a certain set of controls, so on and so forth. Every audit, of course, needs to be objective, have an impartial auditor, and that is critical on the auditor selection. So the short of it basically is a given auditor would not be expected to audit his or her own processes, or certainly his or her own work. The audit itself should culminate with some type of a report, a documented report, and again, that would be put forth to the relevant management of the given area, but then of course roll up to the management review of the top management of the organization itself. And as alluded to, records or documents need to be kept for those audits. The depth of that record obviously is going to be somewhat dependent on the organization, but the CB auditor will look for it to at least represent an idea of what was covered in the audit. So some type of a audit trail, certainly some type of that scope being defined, and then of course any record of any findings or non-conformances. So comparing that, if you will, to the certification process from the CB, I just want to quickly go through a couple of slides here because again, we're talking more on the internal side, but the external side or the certification side is very similar, where we go through and do those activities, ultimately produce a audit report, which then would lead to the certification to demonstrate the compliance through that stage 2 audit. The CB would also have ongoing audits, and there'd be audit reports throughout that process, and looking very much in terms of replicating what is going on in the internal process. From an NQA perspective, and most CBs will have this similar process, NQA does offer a gap assessment, which is kind of a pre-audit or an off-the-record type audit. It is optional. It usually can be tailored to your needs as the organization. The required parts of the certification process begin with the stage 1, which is an audit geared within the objective to determine the readiness of an organization to go through the actual implementation of an audit, which stage 2 is more familiarly called the implementation audit. That is where all the documents or processes or controls that were reviewed kind of on paper in the stage 1 are put to the test. A lot more time spent with people throughout the organization, testing or substantiating that those controls are being adhered to. And that ultimately sets the recommendation for certification. In short, 27001 audits from the CB side, they're not going to be 100% inspections. They're samples. They're samples of the system, the ISMS, really to confirm that a system, a repeatable system, is in place. And I think the same could be said for the internal audits. Similarly, internal audits, along with CB audits, they're really not subjective. They shouldn't be subjective, at least. That they're not what the auditor wants. They should be very objective based based on objective evidence that you as the organization can show or demonstrate. And again, the auditor, be it internal or certification body, should be capturing that objective evidence in their audit records to replicate what was seen to come up with the defined conclusion. 27,000 audits, again, be it internal or external, certainly should not be only about IT. The audit scope or department should certainly not only be IT, because 27,001 done correctly is a holistic organizational approach. You think about certainly a lot of controls and a lot of aspects to information security do reside within IT, so I'm not saying that they're excluded, but the users of those and the information holders and the people who have access to the information, that's going to be throughout the organization. And that, frankly, sometimes is where you see the weaknesses or the opportunities, because those folks aren't as familiar with the IT controls or perhaps the requirements. So you certainly want to make sure that you're focused holistically. And then finally, again, be it internal or external, the audit shouldn't be a one-way street. It shouldn't be the auditor dictating what needs to be done. It really should be a two-way dialogue where the organization or the auditee is describing what they do and why they do it and why they think it's in alignment to either the organization's policies or processes or to the standard itself. So make sure that your audit is a two-way street, that you're defending or standing behind your system, if you will, because that'll make for a much more effective audit. The overall process on the third-party side is following that initial stage 1, stage 2 audit. You're typically granted a certification that's good for 3 years, and that's dependent on you continuing to have surveillance audits. Surveillance audits are typically done annually. You can think of them as kind of checkups. They're shorter in duration. They sample a portion of the system, not the entirety of it. But then back in year 3, coming up to the 3-year certification expiration, is what most CBs would have calling a recertification or perhaps a reassessment audit, which is going to be more similar to the stage 2 audit that you went through initially. Full system audit, expect it to be a little bit longer in duration, and again in more depth and detail. Assuming a successful recertification, you go back into that cycle. So in terms of the documents that are the guiding lights, so to speak, for certification bodies and are useful to organizations to look at in their internal audits, but certainly not required. We referenced these in the outset, 27006 and 17021-1 technically. Both those documents talk about some principles of auditing which could be useful to the internal audit programs. From a CB side, 27006 specifies the audit time that you would be seeing from your certification body, be it for the stage 2 or there's calculations in there to get you to the stage 1, stage 2, surveillance and reassessment. That probably has less of a bearing on the internal audit program. It kind of gives you an idea of what to expect. The auditor skills, I think, is important to look at. And again, you could use that to sort of benchmark the internal audit programs, but for what it's worth, it will define what you would expect as qualifications from an external auditing firm. The processes of the stage 1, stage 2, surveillance, useful in an internal audit perspective, probably more so on the surveillance, where it would define kind of the key processes that you want to make sure that you're looking at, i.e. in your internal audits. CBs then go through the certification decision process and also have a suspension, withdrawal, appeals, complaints processes. Those probably would not be as important to the internal audit program to benchmark, but might be useful for people to look at. In terms of the certification process and why that's important, getting back to that, I think the first thing to consider is that the certification body is meant to be impartial. That's what the third party name implies. So a third party auditor, third party certification body is not reviewing any work that they would have seen before. So there's no consulting or advising or recommending that you'll get from a third party audit. Similarly, in terms of the familiarity of the system, yes, an auditor will get to know your system over time, but most auditors see numerous systems a year, so that familiarity, if you will, is somewhat, take that with a grain of salt. At the end of the day, the auditor from the third party, just like an internal, really should be relying on objective evidence to substantiate the requirements. In theory, there should be no sense of intimidation from the third party because there are defined appeals processes, complaint processes, especially, again, if you're working with an accredited certification body. There are things that are checks and balances in place to make sure that no third party is forcing their ideas or consulting down an organization. And then finally, from a financial perspective, with those mandatory audit timelines, the CB is somewhat impartial in that respect, insofar as it's kind of dictated as to what an audit should take, and there shouldn't be concern that one CB would be significantly underbidding another. There is some plus and minus in there. In terms of what we're responsible for as a certification body versus the client, obviously you as the organization are responsible for setting up the ISMS and making sure that it's conformant to the requirements of the 27001, and that folks within your organization are compliant to your own policies and procedures. And then it's incumbent upon the CB to objectively assess that. And that's really where it gets back to looking at objective evidence to confirm that, yes, the system is in place, and yes, the system as defined meets the requirements of 27001. CBs will keep that information in confidentiality, and that's particularly important, of course, when we're talking about 27001. So that process should start, frankly, right off with any quote or RFP that you're looking for from the CB, but certainly extends to the auditor. The auditor will talk about confidentiality at the opening meetings. Throughout the process, they should not be taking information off site per se. You might wonder what they're writing in their reports, but the reports themselves should be somewhat agnostic and scrubbed to a point where there shouldn't be any confidential information or sensitive information in the reports. However, the reports themselves are really not subject to public view either. The reports will be left with you as the organization. They will go back to the CB office to get reviewed technically, but the confidentiality is maintained there. And finally, as we see here, at least from an accredited certification body perspective too, they are subject to audit from the accreditation body, which might be an important consideration of which accreditation body your certification body uses. ANAB, of course, being the US-based one. There are other internationally based accreditation bodies that may or may not pose some concern. And as I mentioned, CB does get audited, so we're following a lot of the same processes and a lot of the same pain and angst that you folks will. So that's important to look at, and the complaint process that an accreditation body has, again, is an avenue for you to give feedback. So as I mentioned, certainly any audit, be it internal or external, is sampling and not 100% inspection. But there are some potential or likely concerns that can come out of audits based on what we've seen. And that's where I'll hand it over back to Karen to start talking about those 6 expectations.
Thanks, Tim, for showing us how important the third-party audit process is to the overall health and well-being of an internal audit program. Now we'll talk about you made the excellent point that CBs rely on a strong internal audit program and may even reference it in not writing up findings because they see you've already got a handle on something that you're working that is out of alignment, but you've got a good corrective action plan in place and it's valid. So let's go into the top 6 expectations of an internal audit program. According to ISO 27001, as we covered earlier, as Tim talked about, you are required to have an internal audit program with all of these things that are listed here that Tim talked about earlier. But unfortunately, what I've learned from auditors is that one of the common stage 1 audit areas of concern, that is when they first come in and look at your system and see, are you ready to go forward with certification, is that internal audits haven't been done or only a portion of the system has been done. So if the business is so focused on IT or so much on implementing the controls that protect information, they may not have set up the management system around all that as effectively as they need to. They may not have things like management objectives or competency of people or a corrective action system. So that's why it's really one of the first expectations is that you have an internal audit program in place that will make sure that you've done a full system audit before you can even be certified. When you look at your suppliers who may be certified, realize that they have to go through this as well, and you expect them to audit their full system. So for just a minute, let's look at what an internal audit program should look like. It's a key process of your information security management system, and it should be set up as a process just like any other. It needs to be defined, as Tim said, with the frequency and methods and responsibilities and resourced properly by management. It has to be implemented according to the plans, and as Tim mentioned, those plans may change based on risk, based on availability of people and you know what's going on in the business at the time. But having a plan is a lot more likely you'll get it done than if no plan exists. You have to implement against that plan, and then you have to maintain your audit program, making sure that you keep on top of the timeliness, the depth of audits, that you use the management feedback to make changes so that you continually improve. And one of the best ways to continually improve is to focus on upgrading the competence of program management and internal auditors. I like to see that done through sharing audit reports with one another, that an audit report isn't a one-way street from the person who performed the audit, person or people, to the management responsible. But if you have multiple audit team members, that they look at each other's reports and critique them and get feedback from the auditees and from the management team to say, how do we continually improve our program? Are we spending too much time in one place or another? What kind of people do we have doing the audits and so forth? Which is expectation number 2. If a certification body goes in and sees that your auditors are all from one department and may not have experience in the areas that they're looking at to judge compliance, they may say, you know, your auditors may not have the competence to do these audits. Impartiality is not the same thing as ignorance by a long shot. So your auditors need to be skilled in ISO 27001, understand what the standard means and what the controls are asking for. In the guidance documents, be it 27007 and 8 that talk about how to audit, as well as any other 27,000 family requirements that your organization has said are relevant, such as cloud computing. Your internal auditors need to know how to audit against those guidance documents as well if you've built them into your own management system. And then auditors need the general audit skills of planning, conducting audits, and so forth. They need soft skills. As I mentioned, objectivity, they need to be able to collect evidence and report findings based on evidence itself, rather than, oh, I know this kind of thing is always right or always wrong. And then you want to get the right types of auditors, not just individual contributors who are doing this as a stepping, as a block because they're in a certain department. Every department has to cough up an auditor or two. But rather, you want to fill your audit team, especially in newer programs, whether they're auditors or technical experts who participate in audits but may not be responsible for planning or documenting the audits. Bring in some technical experts from within your company from multiple levels and multiple functions for particular parts of the audit to advise on, is what I'm seeing what I'm supposed to be seeing? Because if you don't understand the processes or skills or the necessary parts of the business, you may overlook findings. And ISO 19011 is very clear on the competence of internal auditors. And incidentally, that's one of the things that companies hire DESARA to do internal audits for them for, is they may not have the competence for certain areas that they need to audit, such as top management or a lot of the IT functions, where they can handle other parts of the audits themselves. Now, audit coverage is the third expectation that CBs have of internal audit programs. Your program needs to be set up to take a valid look at the system. That means that you prioritize the higher risk, lower performance areas of the business and put your best people and biggest time against those. Now, that doesn't mean you ignore other areas that may have less confidential information, or that always seem to have their ISMS ducks in a row, but you may audit them less frequently. As Tim said, your plan may be a 3-year plan where you're getting those really tough areas of how IT is managed, or how legal documents are handled, or wherever you may have had some problems in the past, and you audit those more heavily. When you go into the most complex parts of design and IT, you want to be sure you take people in there who really understand those areas and the risks that those areas face. So put your strongest, most experienced people there. And that's what auditors will be looking for. According to ISO 27006, they make it clear that their own audits will be allocated based on risk to the system. And that brings us to the risk-based program overall. As Tim said, they'll really take a strong look at your audit program. And if you're auditing too lightly, if you're auditing not in those areas of the most risk to the business, your audit program deserves to get at least an opportunity for improvement on it, to focus on the right things. In fact, one company I know did their planning of audits by, they knew how many audit resources they had for the year, how many audit man days they had, and they put 2/3 of their audit resources for standard annual audits, saying we're going to be sure we cover everything over the 3-year cycle. But they allowed about 1/3 of the audit time to be set aside for areas that the local management asked for special audits. Now, why might they, what would be some of the risks that they would come up and ask for a special audit? Typically, those risks are when some kind of major change has happened, a reduction in force, a reorganization, merging of companies or departments, or when there's been a problem of some kind, or when they've undergone a third-party audit and found some areas that they need to spend more time into. Another company I know of planned their audit program quarterly. That still works for conducting audits on a planned basis. They had to have somebody oversee it to be sure they didn't get too heavy in one area or another. But whenever they had one of their quarterly management review meetings, managers decided, where are we going to focus our audit resources in the next quarter? And by the way, I wanted to mention audit resources. In ISO 27006, it says how long, well, actually, that brings us to timeliness. How long should we take for our internal audits? If your internal, in 27006, it has the mandatory number of audit days for a third-party audit. And you say, wow, they're looking at everything all at once in a certification audit, and it says it's going to take them 15 days to audit my management system because I've got multiple sites and multiple complex processes and so forth. How many audit days do you suspect you would need as a rule of thumb if your third-party auditor is taking 15 days, 15 man days, maybe 3 auditors for 1 week at your facility? Well, what DESARA has found, our rule of thumb for our clients is 2 to 3 times the number of audit days that it takes for a CB to audit. Why is that? Well, for one thing, the internal auditors don't audit as often. They've got real jobs. They're going to be slower at collecting evidence and writing reports. And by the way, that audit time includes planning and reporting audits, not just standing there interviewing people or looking at evidence. So that's why some people say, and why I'm not surprised, that the #1 answer to our poll was the level of effort it takes to run audits, because getting them done on time, getting reports written promptly and thoroughly before the issues have gone stale, and making sure that people have the time to audit, this all takes planning up front. And your CB should note, not only are your audits done on time, which would mean you've got the right resources, but that you take timely corrective action. It's part of 27001 in clause 10.1 that says when you have a nonconformity, you got to take action, or review the need for taking action anyway, and make sure those audit findings from internal or third-party audits are closed out in a timely manner. And finally, Tim made the point that auditors go back and look at reporting and records. They don't want to see somebody's handwritten scribbled notes about an audit. They need they need the information that ISO 27001 says that you actually have to include in your audit program audit reports. So do you have a description of what happened on the audited, what was audited, who, where, functions, roles, assets, records, projects, whatever it is that you audited, so that they can go back and say, yeah, you had a thorough audit program. Here are the findings that we're going to double check on are closed, or we're going to, actually, they're going to make sure that the changes stuck, that you're actually meeting requirements now. And they're going to make sure that your audit records show that you audited not only the clauses of ISO 27001, but the controls in Annex A and any others you may have taken on. And your audit report should include positives as well as nonconformances, and point out any changes that have happened, whether to the benefit or the detriment of the organization, ISMS. So to summarize those top 6 expectations of an internal audit program, first, you're expected to have a program, and it needs to be managed. It's an essential process that your certification body will be looking for to be sure that you've done. Second, not only do you have enough auditors, but do they have the competence? Are they objective? Do they have the soft skills? And when I say competence, I'm not just saying do they understand the standard and do they understand how to audit, but do they understand the business and the processes, so they know what they're looking at, and they'll understand, they'll recognize a nonconformance or an effective process when they see one. They're not auditing by checklist. Do you do this? Do you do that? And just putting down simple yes and no answers. Third, CBs will be looking at your internal audit program, and your managers ought to be looking at your audit program for all of these things. Have you thoroughly covered the business in a risk-based approach, putting the bulk of your top guns on those areas that are most important to the business, and addressing the inherent risks of an audit program of bias, of not having enough time, of not having well enough trained auditors. Tim's going to talk about, or at the end of the presentation, we'll talk about closing some of those risks to your audit program. And you see how, as Tim discussed, CBs have a risk-based approach to their audit program. They look at things like, how do they maintain impartiality? How do they maintain objectivity and confidentiality? They build those into their program. You have to look at the risks of not only to the business of information security, but risks to your audit program. And as I said, we'll talk about those more in a few minutes. CBs expect timeliness on your internal audit program, and that means that audits are done on time, within reason, that your reports are written up and acted upon within a reasonable amount of time, given the importance of the findings that you have. And finally, that your records, CBs rely on your audit reports. They rely on them to be accurate and available, just like any other record of your management system. So let's take a poll now. I'll ask my assistant, Mariah, to post the next poll so that we can look at how effective is your internal audit program now. And this will be on a 1 to 5 basis. Would you say 5 stars, it's well planned, well managed, consistently improved, it is an essential process of your business that people are working effectively? Go ahead and enter your results to this poll, and let's see what people think. People, you know, it's not a random sample. I do have ISMS geeks and audit geeks on this call, so we expect that most people here have pretty good familiarity with what's in their program. Go ahead and answer this poll, and we'll compare the results. Are you down on the we're just getting started and we need a lot of work? Again, if you're a consultant or a certification body auditor, base this on what you've seen in the field. How well are your audit programs working? Looks like we've got a good portion of the votes in. They're still coming a little bit. Let's wait a few more seconds. And they're shaking out just about how I expected them to for this call, given that we said it was intermediate content. Okay, Mariah, will you close the poll and we'll review the results? Okay, so we've got just 17% on the really well planned and managed and improved consistently. And as expected, right in the middle, we meet the minimum requirements. And I'm glad to see that, because it means that I hope that what you're getting on this call is some ideas that you can use going forward to improve the respect and the continual improvement of your audit program. For those of you who are in the needs improvement, just starting, or questionable, I hope that that means that you're just getting started, and you too can pick up ideas from here to go forward. But if you've got a meets the minimum or questionable, or you're just getting started, ask yourselves whether getting outside help might take you a little further. And there are a number of places you can go for outside support through various sister companies maybe that also have certifications, swapping auditors site to site, but really sitting down with management and asking what are their expectations and what are they willing to give to get those expectations met. Really focus on improving the effectiveness of your internal audit program, and it'll work much more hand in hand to build your system up with your CB's audit program. So now I'll hand it over to Tim to talk about how CB audits are different from internal audits. Tim?
Okay, thanks, Karen. So coming into the home stretch here, I think a lot of this will be kind of self-evident, but let's start off with the formality. Thinking about an internal audit versus your certification party audit. Obviously, the internal audit is going to be a lot more informal. End of the day, we still want to see those records, we want to see those documents, but through the course of the audit, the auditors have a little more flexibility in terms of talking through some of the issues. There's not going to be the hard and fast time limits necessarily. Any findings that may be identified, the auditor has the ability to help with the corrective action or help root cause the issue. Those are primarily not going to be allowed during the certification body audit. It's going to be a little more formal, a little more stuck on time, so to speak. We go back to that required amount of time that we're going to spend. You'll get a quote of how much length or how many days a given audit's going to be, and we don't have the ability to shorten that or lengthen that. So the auditor's got to work within that fixed time. Therefore, if issues do come up, at some point the auditor needs to say, okay, based on the information I have here, I need to move on. So it's either an issue or not. And if there are issues, if there are nonconformances, the auditor will certainly be very clear in what the nonconformance is, tie it back to the requirement that's not being met, and can give some interpretations of that requirement, but they need to stop there. They can't give any further guidance of how to fix it or what the corrective action could or should be in their opinion. That gets back into the consulting that we cannot do. Really can't help root cause it either. So that's a big difference in the formality. In terms of the scheduling and time available, again, kind of already alluded to that, but obviously an internal audit, most of the time I will say the internal audits are broken up over a number of audits over the course of the year. So right off the bat, you see more flexibility there insofar as the time is spread out. It's probably not going to be a fixed amount of time. So a given audit would be scheduled for a day, but it may or may not be scheduled for X many hours, or it could roll over if need be, perhaps. Again, comparing that to the CB audit, where they're there for a fixed number of days. And that auditor will need to get done what they need to get done within that time period. I know there was a question about remote audit, and while that's not the focus of this presentation, I think that the comment can kind of fit in here. So yeah, we're talking about information technology for the most part, and you're on a webinar now, and we're all talking and sharing the same screen. So that is more and more becoming a viable audit approach, whether it's an internal audit or frankly a third-party audit. There are, again, rules that the certification bodies need to follow in terms of remote auditing, but it is becoming more and more accepted within certain boundaries. It usually cannot apply to a physical type environment, so a manufacturing type environment. But when we're talking 27001, yeah, there's a lot that can be done through remote audits, and certainly there's nothing prohibiting that from your internal audits. Leveraging the remote capabilities that are out there. So in terms of some of the focus areas in terms of CBs versus internals, the CB is going to be looking more, again, formally at the leadership, their commitment, objectives, documentation. All of these things are going to be a little bit more per the standard, show me where you've met the requirements of this given requirement. On the internal side, there's that flexibility again. So the leadership can kind of guide or say that we want to focus on certain areas more than others. At the end of the day, yeah, the leadership needs to go through the internal audit as well. This is not saying that leadership gets a free pass and that those requirements, say of Section 5, can be excluded, but they can help guide with some of the others. We talked about the internal requirements and the familiarity that the auditor would probably have on the internal side with some of the organizational challenges, some of the organizational processes for that matter, both on the good and bad side, I suppose. And that's again where the discussion about the audit team becomes important, to think about who is going to be the most effective auditor for a given process or department or set of controls. Which gets us into some of the sampling size and the risks to that. My short takeaway on this is that the bigger the sample, the better. And again, as an internal audit, you have the flexibility to do that, to spend more time, to go deeper. As Karen said, the external auditor is going to be limited. So take as much of a sample as you can to feel comfortable with those processes, with those controls through your internal audits. Which kind of leads us to risk. And at the end of the day, the internal audit program you have is risk management. The better the internal audit, the better your certification audit is going to go. So I strongly encourage you to think of your internal audits not just as another requirement or as a chore that you need to get done or a box you need to tick, but it really is a value to your overall implementation. So spend the right time on it, spend the right resources on that, and it'll pay dividends. And then finally, kind of ties into the expertise, the auditors themselves. Karen talked a lot about that earlier. Obviously, all auditors are going to need some sort of training, and they may come with that. They may need that moving forward. That, from my perspective, and most auditors, I think would be kind of twofold. One is auditing skills, as Karen mentioned, soft skills and otherwise, but also on the certain technical discipline, in this case, 27001. So yeah, CBs will expect to see some sort of training, and certainly some sort of training on the given standard being audited. And I'll be honest, that becomes self-evident in the internal audit reports that we look at. The depth of the audit, the depth of the non-conformances or lack thereof sometimes can certainly put questions in an auditor's head about the effectiveness of the auditor and the auditor and the internal audit program. So again, don't skimp on this, because it's going to be pretty clear to the external auditor of how strong the internal audit program is. So with that, I think we're closing in on time. So Karen, I'll let you bring it home.
Okay, thanks, Tim. I mentioned earlier that you want your program itself to be risk-based. So you're looking at audit being an essential business process, the essential process of maintaining a management system. So what you want to do to address the risk of it not being effective, having the wrong auditors, or having not enough competence in the areas that they need to audit, you need to have a well-managed program and do your auditor selection effectively, so that you're constantly driving skill development through ongoing training. I want to bring this home in saying that I've done a lot of training with companies on their internal audits of quality auditors. Most companies that have an ongoing quality management system, everyone is swimming in the quality soup all the time. You've got procedures, you've got methods, you've got, people understand a lot more about the expectations of quality than your general layperson understands the requirements for information security, the behind the scenes type stuff that has to happen. So that's why one of the things that we do with our audit training on ISO 27001 is we do it on 9001 as well, but it's very important on 27001. If you go through an internal auditor course, it's important that you get some coaching from somebody who's either an experienced auditor on your staff, or one of the things DESARA does is we follow on from the training with an audit workshop. So we do 2 to 3 days of training and 2 to 3 days of actual auditing within the company, so that We get some of your more complex audits done with the newly skilled auditors, maybe bringing in some of your more experienced auditors and tearing apart the audit process and saying, what do we want to improve based on what we learned? We talked about risk-based coverage of your program. Make sure it's responsive to changes in risks over time and responsive to what the management team asks for. Make sure that you plan your resources and competence and management commitment. Get the audits done on time, get the reports filed, take action against them, build accountability into the program, have business oversight to take timely actions. This can come through weekly and monthly staff meetings, taking a look at what's still open, through your management reviews, surely, to see any trends in nonconformances over time. Make sure that your reporting and records are up to date because CBs rely on those heavily. So one risk to your audit program is that you do it and it's lightweight, or you do it and it's really not, it really doesn't have the backup of management. So peer review of your audit report and peer review of follow-up for effectiveness are important in your audit program. And we're right at the top of the hour, and we will take time for questions for anyone who stays on the line. But and so now is the time. If you haven't asked any questions yet, I see a couple more have come in. We'll answer those. But stay on the line with us if you can, if you care to, and we'll go through some questions here. But Tim, we talked about accredited certification bodies. And one of the things DESARA has done is looked around far and wide across the United States and said, who are the certification bodies who we've recognized do an excellent job? One of the reasons we like to work with clients who choose NQA as their accredited certification body is that you've got the depth of auditors, you've got the geographic span, and you've got the coverage of multiple standards. That's very important for companies who want an integrated management system rather than one company to come in and do audits of one kind and a different auditor come in later in the year to do a different kind of audit. NQA can manage that all as one overall program. What else would you like to point out about NQA and the importance of working with an accredited certification body?
Well, I think one of the things is exactly that. Obviously, the fact that NQA is accredited and accredited through the U.S. accreditation body, ANAB. And further to that, NQA's ISMS program, and frankly, all the programs that we offer here out of NQA USA are run out of the U.S. In some instances, other certification bodies will have the customer service or the technical groups outside of the country. We just don't do that for anything, but particularly when you're talking about information security, I know that some organizations would have that as a consideration. If your auditors are coming from another country, or if your audit reports are going outside the country to be reviewed, is that a consideration? With NQA, we keep it all in the US. And then I think last but not least is our customer focus. We hear all too often that this industry is kind of rife with lack of customer service or lack of customer satisfaction. And NQA, through its 30 plus years, has been very focused on the customer. Obviously, there's a line that we need to be aware of that bridges over from auditing to consulting, but that shouldn't stop us from answering the phone or answering emails or providing technical guidance when asked.
Yes, absolutely. CBs are allowed to provide the actual interpretation, generic understanding of what the standard says. We're a company like the DESARA group, and CBs will refer their clients to consultants when the clients start asking too many questions. Can you give me a template for that? Can you give me advice on how to do this or that? Well, the DESARA group has been consultants to dozens of implementation teams across many different standards. And we bring the experience that allows you to accelerate your ISMS development, reinvigorate programs such as quality, information security, Six Sigma, and so forth if they've kind of gone by the wayside. And part of that is that because of the skill and experience of the consultants that we put on the job, we're a very small team, very close, just like NQA said, the customer service commitment that our company has. We're eyeball to eyeball with your directors and vice presidents in charge of all projects, and we don't bring in a team of recent college graduates to work on something. We bring in people who meet you eyeball to eyeball. And we streamline the management system implementation so that what might take you stop and start over a period of years, once you make a commitment to work on a program with the DESARA group, we bring in a lot of accountability and streamlining to get your system certified. So we did have some questions come in, and Tim, I think this first one, you answered one of the questions that came in. That was the about remote audits, that companies can do that internally. They can perform remote audits to their little heart's content as long as they're able to get to the physical areas that they need to get to through the physical controls and to talk to all the number of different people that they need to talk to. We had a question about integrating management systems. Patty says her company is certified to AS9100, and I can imagine why the aerospace industry would be very interested in security. So talk to me a little bit about integrating management systems and integrating the audits of management systems. Are they integrating the requirements, and how does that work from a CB perspective?
Sure, and before I do that, just one more thing on the remote audits. For the CB guidance, that document that you can look at if you're interested is called IAF MD4, recently revised, like I say, to keep up with the time. So remote audits will become more and more of a thing.
And I believe the number was about was 30%, right?
Remote integration also becoming more and more of a thing as certifications become more and more popular. And yes, you can integrate ISO 27000 with other standards. In fact, with the recent releases of a lot of the standards, including AS9100 and ISO 9000 for that matter, where they've adopted the Annex SL model, that's what caused all the clauses to get moved around and the numbering to change. But 27001 had previously adopted that structure. So currently, things like ISO 9001 or AS9100 are very easily integrated because the base structure, the skeleton, if you will, is in lockstep. So certainly from an organizational perspective, you can integrate your systems as you implement them. You can, in theory, integrate them as you internally audit them. Obviously, the concerns there would be getting the right competencies and the right coverage and so on and so forth. And I'll speak for NQA because I can't speak for everyone, but yes, NQA does offer integrated audits. And certain schemes or certain standards are easier to integrate than others, because the other thing you need to think about is, can a given auditor audit both standards or all three standards or however many are in place. AS9100 and 27001 is not unheard of, but I will admit it is one of the rarer combinations that auditors have, but it is possible, and actually NQA does have a couple of folks that can do that.
Okay, another question came in about NIST 800-52 versus ISO 27001. Tim, would you like to speak to that, or shall I?
Sure. Yeah, there are several NIST standards, and in short, any of the NIST standards have a various set of controls. So the NIST standards are focused more on the controls. So the mapping that you'd want to look at would be the controls in the given NIST standard that you're looking at to the Annex A controls within 27001. And in some cases, the standards will have kind of a mapping built into that. You'd want to do your due diligence and make sure that you agree with that. But what we often see is that 27001, again, provides a good structure, and I would say a more robust structure, because it's that holistic management system in which to incorporate something like NIST 800-171 controls or NIST 852 controls. It's very clear within 27001 that the controls in Annex A are set forth as best practices, so to speak, but not the be-all, end-all. So if there were other controls that you wanted to add in under your 27001 system, that certainly is allowable and certainly very feasible. So that's where the combination of something like NIST and 27001 can work together, where those additional controls are baked into your 27001 program.
Now, Tim, as I understand it, when you go out to audit, if a company has baked in those NIST controls or GDPR or HIPAA or any other types of controls that they've baked into their management system, when you're auditing them against their own management system as well as 27001, and they should be doing that internally as well. Is that right?
That's correct. So yeah, if you incorporate those under your set of controls in Annex A, then they're subject to audit, certainly from the CB side, and I would expect from the internal side as well.
And that's the beauty of getting 27001 around a NIST standard that you've adopted internally, is that you get that internal audit and external audit expertise to say where the NIST standards don't mandate internal audits. You've got that structure, and that's what Tim was talking about, what 27001 adds to it. So they work hand in hand. They're not designed to be choose one or the other. Another question that has come up and I want to bring out is, who audits the internal audit? Because we talk about impartial, and is it okay for the management system to wait and say, well, our internal audit program is audited by our CB? Or do you have to somehow come up with an internal audit of your internal audit program, Tim?
Well, that's always a tough one, especially in smaller organizations. I guess the short answer is the current wording of the standards, be it 27001 or any of the new Annex SL models, doesn't explicitly prohibit someone from auditing themselves, but they do need to be objective and impartial. So it's tough to do that if you're auditing your own work or your own department even. So best case scenario is always to have some arm's length separation from the auditor and the process. Again, in the smallest organizations, that might just have to be a different person within the same general remit. But in larger organizations, it's always best to have someone of a different department.
Yeah, one way that can be done is to have, if you don't have skilled auditors who are outside of the people who conducted the audits, one thing you can do is use an auditor who maybe has rotated off the program to come in and audit. They still have the audit skills, they still understand. Another way is to use somebody who maybe has audit skills and doesn't have 27001 skills, with a technical expert, with somebody who does understand 27001 and could look at the depth of the program and the skills of the auditors and could provide an internal audit as a team that way to guard against impartiality. And a third way, and this is where DESARA comes in, is we will often be the ones who audit top management, the people who audit the upper parts of the various departments that have a lot of say over the management system, and we'll audit the internal audit program. So there you're getting an outside look at how you've done. When we do a company's entire audit program, what we do is have one of our skilled 27001 internal auditors or implementation people audit our audits of that management system, or the client audits our audit of the internal audit system program, to be sure that we've got a fair and impartial audit of that. So with that, we're 15 minutes over time. I think we got all the questions that were, oh, there's one more. Does 27001 have something like QMS rep that is identified for the company? Are they required to have a, are they still required under, or does 27001 require an ISMS representative, management representative? Tim?
I guess the short answer is no. And again, that's where it kind of lines up to the current Annex SL model, where 9001 technically doesn't have a management rep term used either. But that said, all the same roles and responsibilities and duties are in the standard. So someone still needs to be responsible for ensuring that the ISMS conforms to the standard, that it's reported on its performance, and so on and so forth. But a given individual called the ISMS rep does not exist in the wording of the standard.
Okay, thanks, Tim. I know you know that standard inside out. So it's very valuable to have a CB on the call with us today. DESARA does a number of webinars, and I know NQA does as well. So I hope that as companies look at their next steps toward pursuing ISO 27001, they will look at studying the standard as well as the guidance documents, attending webinars, doing a self-assessment, and making sure that you've got that management commitment behind your implementation of your audit program, not just get it off the ground and get that initial certification. One last thing, we are developing virtual instructor-led classroom training. That is, it would look like this webinar, except with a smaller group that we can have back and forth interaction. We can have practice exercises and so forth. We customize those for companies right now that will work with multi-site teams, or those that can't all get to a certain location for training. And then we also we will be offering that as public training, where you only have 1 or 2 people who may need to attend training right now. I'd ask you to contact DESARA. You've got our address through the multiple emails that we've gotten about the webinar itself, and let us know if we can help you in your internal audit program as well. And be sure to keep NQA in mind as one of the top accredited certification bodies in the world for information security management. So thank you for attending the webinar today, and I look forward to seeing you on future NQA and DESARA webinars. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.